Morning to those in the UK. Good evening to those in Australia. My name's Gawain Little. I'm General Secretary of the General Federation of Trade Unions in the UK. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Tom Mann Internationalist webinar, part of the ongoing Tom Mann Internationalist Tour 2024. We've got a fantastic panel for you today, and hopefully what will be a lively discussion. Before we get into that, just a little bit of information about the session that you've joined today. So this meeting's being supported by Manifesto Press, the Morning Star, Strike Map, and the General Federation of Trade Unions. Information about those organisations will be posted in the chat during the call, so you can find out a bit more about the partners who've come together to bring this meeting to you. There'll also be a behaviour statement which will be posted in a chat in a moment now. I'm sure we're not expecting any poor behaviour, but please do have a read through it so we can make sure that everything remains appropriate. This call is being recorded and also live streamed on Facebook. It's in webinar format, so if you've joined as a member of the audience, if you've joined as an attendee, you won't be able to switch your camera or microphone off, but you should be able to see all of the panel for today on the screen. That's the way the meeting's been set up. You do have access to the chat, so please do introduce yourselves in the chat, say where you're from, share ideas with each other. But you also, at the bottom of your screen, have a box marked Q&A for questions and answers. We'd really like you during the opening speeches to post your questions in that section under the Q&A, not in the chat, but in the Q&A. And what we'll do is we'll take a selection, hopefully as many as we can, of those questions from the Q&A and put them to the panel once we've heard their opening contributions, so that we can get into a bit more discussion and open up on some of those ideas. Please use the chat to add other comments, but also look out for the information links that will be posted during the meeting in the chat. I think that's probably all of the housekeeping from me. Before I hand over to my co-chair, I just want to say I am very, very pleased on behalf of the General Federation of Trade Unions to be taking part in this important webinar. International solidarity has been, since the founding of the GFTU, which Tom Mann played a role in, international solidarity has been absolutely right at the heart of what we do. And when we come together internationally, right across the world, to learn from each other, to build on our strengths and support each other through difficult times, we show that we, as a trade union movement, can make a difference. United, we stand. So on that note, I'm really, really pleased to hand over to my co-chair for today, Jo, who's going to introduce herself and a little bit more about today's meeting.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gawain, and good evening and good morning. I'm also very delighted to be here this evening as the co-chair. I begin by acknowledging that I'm joining all of you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, or Sydney, as many of you would know it. I acknowledge their continuing custodianship of the lands and the waters and air, and that sovereignty was never ceded. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people who are joining us on the webinar. For us, it's important that we acknowledge country as a way of recognising the traditional owners of the land and paying our respects and giving thanks for their custodianship. As a nation, we have a lot of unfinished business, and acknowledgement at our events and our meetings is an important part of signifying our commitment to do that work. For large in-person gatherings, we would also ask one of the traditional owners to welcome us to their country in the same way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have sought permission for thousands of years as they've travelled across the different lands across this continent. as I said, I'm delighted to be here and have had the pleasure of hosting Phil Katz during his time in Australia. We've probably cemented our mutual admiration society, and have had the pleasure of hearing each other speak at a number of engagements recently. And Phil suggested that I share some of the work that Women in Super has been doing. So I'm the CEO of Women in Super, which is a national advocacy and networking group for women employed in superannuation and associated financial services. And effectively, our role is advocating to remove the gendered inequity in superannuation. So we advocate for structural reforms for women to receive a more equitable share of Australians' flourishing superannuation assets. And I'll try not to steal any of Casey's thunder, but when we talk about the assets that workers own in this country, it's currently sits at $3.5 trillion. So at the heart of everything we do is working for a fairer superannuation system to ensure that women retire with dignity and economic security. So our system, which was achieved through the campaigning of hard work of unions in the 70s and 80s, is the envy of the world. But the reality is that it was designed for people who could work full-time, uninterrupted for 40 years, i.e. men. So our system, again, the envy of the world, is built on the inherent gendered inequality that compulsory super, which is currently 12%, is paid on wages. So women earn less and are more likely to take time out of the workforce for caring responsibilities. So the system doesn't work for them in the same way. So we've had 30 years of compulsory super, which is an incredible achievement. But the system is delivering incredible outcomes for millions of working Australians, but we still have a two-speed system with many women left behind. At the moment, the gender super gap sits at around 25% in the years approaching retirement, which means a woman will retire on average with $53,000 less than their male counterparts. We know that the drivers of gender inequality for retired women and women more broadly are systemic, stubborn, and multifaceted. So it means that Women in Super's work really covers a broad range of areas within people's lives, not just in their working lives. But we have had some wins, and I just want to share one of those with you now before we move to the panel proper. After 13 years of persistent and consistent and collective action, 2 weeks ago, the government announced that from the 1st of July next year, superannuation will be paid on their paid parental leave scheme. This is a significant outcome, because what our modelling shows is that 12% of super guarantee being paid on the 26 weeks of the government paid parental leave could result in a boost of over $5,000 to a retirement balance. You multiply that by multiple children, and potentially this accounts for a substantial percentage of the $53,000 disparity between men and women's balances, and will improve the balances of approximately 180,000 women annually. But we know there's no silver bullet to close this gap, and we still have many other issues that we're advocating on. Tax concessions in this system favour the high paid and result in significant inequities for those in the lowest income tax bracket. Care work continues to be undervalued or unvalued, and this disproportionately affects the retirement outcomes for women. And there, of course, is still work to be done to ensure that every dollar paid attracts superannuation, including for workers under 18 years of age who are currently excluded. So we will continue to fight hard alongside our unions and other gender equality advocates, as we always have, to achieve our end goal. And that's that all women in this country retire into safety, from a safe place to live to a retirement income that affords them dignity. And together with persistence, consistency, and collective action, we will win. So thank you very much for having me and for giving me the opportunity to say a few words about women in super. But it's now my pleasure to move to our guest speaker to kick us off for the session. Currently sitting in my spare room, so hopefully we're not experiencing any echoing here. Many of you will know Phil Katz, author, activist, who's currently touring Australia, speaking to large audiences of union delegates, workplace representatives at Trades Hall in Melbourne earlier this week, and in Sydney last night, industrial councils and in universities about his book on Tom Mann. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Phil. Thanks, comrade.
Thanks very much for that, Jo. I'm also thrilled to welcome to our meeting Marion Mann, who's the granddaughter of Tom Mann. That's wonderful. She's currently in Spain. Greetings to you, Marion. You must have the best genes going. So Tom Mann's life was epic. Over a 70-year period, his political thinking evolved to embrace Swedenborg Christianity, trade unionism, municipal socialism, then industrial unionism, syndicalism, and Marxism. In Britain, Australia, China, South Africa, Russia, and the USA, he set about creating unions to channel the enormous collective power of working class people into mass action for change, all without the internet or a smartphone. From around 1908, he actually envisaged workers through their unions taking over the economic and democratic functions of society. And many of those structures that he built exist today. I'm talking to you from Sydney, and I'd like to acknowledge the generosity of the Manufacturing Workers Union, Steve Murphy, its General Secretary, who read my book and made the tour possible, the Mining and Engineering Union, and the Trades Councils, who've laid on so many meetings. So far on my tour, I've spoken to over 1,000 workplace reps in manufacturing, mining, and energy, and we're not finished yet. And we're also not hiding the many things that Tom stood for. I'd also like to thank John Dixon, past General Secretary of the Fed, for organising the tour and being so generous with his time. 125 years ago, Tom landed in New Zealand and then Australia. He was already the best known trade unionist in the world. He'd worked down the mines at 10 years old and dedicated his life to uprooting poverty. He was the leading advocate of the 8-hour day. That's 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, and 8 hours for the restitution and rebuilding of family, community, and society. And in his hands, the campaign for the 8-hour day at once improved the immediate working life of workers, but also came to define the outer contours of a different kind of living, which he called socialism. And he took that campaign with him wherever he went. He stayed in Australia for nearly 10 years, founded unions, the Victorian Socialist Party, was imprisoned in Melbourne for fighting for free speech, and later led the silver and lead miners of Broken Hill during their great lockout, when he was arrested for sedition, but acquitted. Mann returned to England a seasoned and brilliant strike leader, who led the Mersey ports and transport workers to victory during the Great Unrest in 1911. He'd given his first speech in defense of the Russian Revolution in Melbourne in 1905, and the Revolution of 1917 confirmed in him that the question of capitalism or socialism was a class issue. And thus he became a founder member and long-term leader of the Communist Party, also serving on the presidium of the Red International of Labour Unions and going clandestinely to China for 6 months at the age of 72 to organise a union centre. I've got to be honest, it's exhausting even talking about him, let alone exhausting for him. Deported, arrested, imprisoned, nothing could dampen his ardour for the cause. And in 1936, in the East End of London, people marked his 80th birthday in what has been called the most representative gathering ever of British Labour. A similar party was held in Melbourne at the same time, where civic buildings and the trades hall flew the red flag. It still flies the red flag, by the way. Tom sang to them in Russian and Chinese, then volunteered to go and fight for the Spanish Republic. His energy and commitment was without equal. So much has changed since his death in 1941, but the unions and the political forces he helped to build are being constantly replenished. In Britain, the unions have been able to withstand a sustained and concerted ruling class offensive. In Australia, unions that he built are combative across a much wider range, a wider front than back at home. Having just last week won a major victory on pension rights for women that Joe explained, but also I think a world leader is that they have secured a transition council in which the unions play the leading role. Mann thought that unions were at their strongest when they were at the centre of communities. He believed there was enough power in solidarity to allow unions to reshape entire societies. In fact, unions were only restricted in their vision because they put the blinkers on themselves. And he thought that the structures of capitalism required workers to unite across borders. The Great Dock Strike of 1889 was mainly funded from Australia. The Great Wharf Strike in Australia the following year was mainly funded from Britain. There's a special bond between the labour movements of both of our countries. Tom's success was in part down to the meticulous way that he would research wages, conditions, and the labour process against which he was organising. He was once smuggled down the diamond mines of Kalgoorlie so that he'd know the conditions firsthand before he could organise. Today, in both the British and Australian labour movements, we have considerable collective intellect. Half of Britain's trade unionists have a degree or a higher qualification, but our intelligence is poor. We barely understand the character of the forces reined against us, how they operate, what is their strategy, what are their alliances, how do they operate around the globe. But these forces are dominating our lives. The struggle against poverty hasn't gone away, and I hope that this meeting will help us to understand these factors a little better. Enjoy the meeting, comrades.
Thank you, Phil. Let's get straight into the panel and explore some of the ideas that Phil has just outlined for us. So our first panelist is Nigel Flanagan. So Nigel is a political activist and union organiser based in Liverpool in the UK. He's been an activist for many years before becoming a global union organiser working in Africa, India, Russia and Palestine. His book, Our Trade Unions, about the recent UK strike wave has been described as a bruising read for many unions. Over to you, Nigel.
Oh, thank you very much, and good morning, good evening, everybody. And the first thing I'd like to say is what an excellent initiative this is. And Phil's book is a great read. You know, I've got to say, he writes better than he speaks, if you can believe that. So I hope you get the opportunity to buy the book and read it. I am actually sat just a few hundred yards away from where Tom Mann addressed tens of thousands of striking workers in Liverpool during the 1911-1912 transport workers' strike. And he was given the nickname at the time by the press, the Dictator of Liverpool. So I just want to pay my little tribute to Tom Mann on St. George's Hall, a wonderful photograph of him addressing the masses of strikers there, and to give the public promise that we've said to Phil, we'll get him to Liverpool and get the same photograph of him there where Tom stood and addressed those workers. But in the short time I have here, I want to really briefly give you two miserable messages before hoping that you will be provoked into reading the book and hopefully looking at what we are beginning to think may be a way out of the situation that we're in. There is no doubt that the strike wave of 22-23 in the UK was huge, was completely unexpected in many quarters, and involved a whole range of national ballots, local ballots, victories, pay rises won, and so on and so forth. And suddenly, from nowhere, the trade unions were on the news every evening. The trade unions were being discussed by politicians. The trade unions were being attacked by the media for ruining the railway system, for destroying the NHS, for undermining children's education, and all the things that traditionally we're always accused of. However, we cannot just allow the euphoria around that resurgence to blind us to the fact that there are still long-term problems. And here are four figures I want to give you, which, if you like this kind of masochistic analysis of trade union density in the UK, you can read them in the book. First of all, in 2023, only 3.8% of trade union members in the UK were under the age of 24. That's a huge cliff drop in generational terms. Secondly, in 2022, the first year of the upsurge in activity, trade union membership in the UK declined by approximately 200,000 members. 120,000 members of whom were women working in the private sector. In 2023, 75% of trade union members in the UK are over the age of 35. And finally, trade union density in the UK is half what it was in 1979 in an economy with 3 million more workers than there were in 1979. So there's a stark sort of reality under the surface of what's going on inside the British union movement. And there is no doubt it's even more disastrous in the United States, and even in some of the traditionally stronger European trade union movements, it is the graph heading down in the same direction. So where do we look for our inspiration? Where do we look for solutions to these global problems? Well, the first place is obviously Tom Mann. Tom Mann was an internationalist. Tom Mann understood the need for global links between trade unions, and his wide experience of how unions and labour operated around the world is a huge, rich sort of treasury for us of looking at how we need to organise ourselves. The second area the reason why the word bruising came up is because it becomes clear that the organising guru strategies of many people in Western Europe and the United States are making very little difference to the overall density and power of the trade union movement. And that these operations and these community organising strategies that have been transported across into the movement work to a limited degree, but they are not the grand strategic solution to the lack of power and the lack of density. Quite often we see a pattern that where full-time organisers move on from a dispute, the trade union organisation tends to flatten again. One thing that we have tried to point out in the book, and it's a project that's been undertaken by myself and other writers in Manifesto Press, is what we are calling the decolonising of the Western trade union movement, taking out some of these imperial and racist subconscious assumptions about what is the future of organised labour in the world. Only 10% of workers in the world are organised into trade unions. 40% of the world's workers are either children or slaves. So the solutions and the problems should be a global context and not simply a Western European or North American one. Quick example as I finish is I was working on an organising project with the Kenyan Security Workers Union in Kenya. There are 500,000 security guards in Kenya. Kenya is a country in many ways that is insecure in terms of concerns about terrorism and security across the whole sector. The union there had 8,000 members. In an industry that employs 500,000 people, that's pretty powerless. They set about wanting to organise the workforce with a strategy. And that strategy at the beginning involved employing full-time workers. After 6 months, nothing was changing. And the union leadership took the quite brave decision at the time to get rid of the union organisers and replace them with motorbikes. Now, I was a bit sceptical. I thought, hang on, I know motorbikes, I like them, but they're not good talkers, they're not good listeners. And why are we using the motorbike? And they immediately and quite dramatically proved me and others wrong on that score. The motorbikes we use to get around, to put the activists on motorbikes to get around from workplace to workplace, because security guards are quite dissipated across. They usually work on their own. Long story short, within 4 years, they'd gone from 8,000 members to over 100,000 members. They are the fastest growing trade union in Africa. What they did was base their activity on national demand in the industry and on resourcing the activists. I think, and we certainly argued that in the book, that this is partly what we now have to do, is to be looking at examples in the global south of trade union organisation and learning from our brothers and sisters, comrades and friends in Africa, in Russia, in Latin America, about how they are managing to do better in many cases than we are doing. Final example I want to give you, I'm sure you're more aware of it than I am, the largest general strike ever organised in history, involving 245 million workers, was in India in 2020 and early 2021. I have yet to see waves of Western European, British, North American organisers or leaders going to Africa, to India and ask, how did you do that? What did you learn? What went wrong? What would you do again? And this is the conversation, exactly and precisely the conversation that somebody like Tom Mann would initiate, I believe. So I hope my short session there has given you a little bit of a sense of the bruising aspect of the book. Read it, argue with it, agree with it, disagree with it. But we can all agree on one thing. We need more Tom Manns, and Tom Mann as an international global union organizer is one of the many examples that we should follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nigel. And a really important reminder there that actually national solidarity doesn't mean just that bilateral solidarity that we can build with one country here or one country there, but looking right across the world at examples of international union organising and drawing from where those successes are happening, as you say, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and building on and learning from those successes. Massively important. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our next panel speaker, Casey Thompson. Casey was an organizer for the Construction, Forestry, Mining and Maritime Union, and Casey oversees the Australian Council of Trade Unions Centre for Workers' Capital and Superannuation across Australia and internationally as Workers' Capital Manager at ACTU. Casey organises union fund trustees to be better trained and effective in the pension sector as more and more funds buy into contracts that allow unions to have a significant impact on membership, wages and conditions. So, Casey, you're very, very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. It's fantastic to be here with you all to discuss Phil's fantastic book. on the inspirational life of Tom Mann and to hear from all of the speakers around the world today about the ways in which Tom's legacy is carried on today. As has been said, my name is Casey Thompson and I am the Workers' Capital Manager at the Australian Council of Trade Unions, or the ACTU. Since its formation in 1927, the ACTU has been the peak trade union body in Australia. There's no other national confederation representing Australian unions. Together with 37 affiliate unions, the ACTU represents 1.8 million Australian trade union members who work across all industries and occupations, from mining and manufacturing to hospitals and schools. Today, I would like to talk to you about what we like to often call the quiet revolution in Australia of workers' capital, otherwise known as superannuation or as pensions to many of you. I think that Australia's system of compulsory superannuation is very fitting with Tom Mann's legacy of revolutionary trade union and social reform, because superannuation is a transformative institution of wealth redistribution to working people born out of the Australian trade union movement. Australia's system is, as Joe has alluded to, qualitatively different to most pension systems around the world. It is compulsory and universal. It is paid for by employers. It is fully vested and it's fully portable. It was designed on the premise that employers have a responsibility to contribute to working people's lives after the employer has reaped the benefit of a lifetime of their labour. Since its creation, working people continue to work to ensure that Australia's superannuation system is well governed, delivers high returns for members, charges low fees, and invests workers' money, workers' capital, in ways that improves workers' lives. Before I speak about the transformative power of workers' capital and the ways in which working people in Australia and around the world come together in solidarity to ensure that workers' capital is delivering for working people, I think it's important to explain a little bit more about how superannuation in Australia was born. The history of compulsory and universal superannuation in Australia is a history of union struggle. Superannuation is not a financial product or a financial service. It is a fundamental industrial right that unions fought for. Many in Australia speak of superannuation as something that the government handed down. But like we know is true of all industrial rights, it would not have ever been enshrined in legislation if it was not first won in workplaces across the country through industrial struggle. If working people in Australia had not set up their own superannuation funds to show that it could be done, and if working people had not generated the political momentum to have it enshrined for all workers through Parliament. And superannuation in Australia was first and foremost a worker demand. Workers in Australia were retiring without sufficient retirement income, and many were living their retirement lives in poverty after a lifetime of hard work. And therefore, Australian workers demanded that their unions campaign for greater retirement incomes. And it was decided that this should be achieved through employer contributions into funds that allowed compound interest to grow this money over workers' working lives. This was called for instead of only increasing the government-provided age pension, because firstly, we all know that Tory governments will always cut government spending, and therefore this money is not protected into the future. And secondly, while pensions, government-provided pensions, remain a critical part of Australia's retirement income, and Australian unions today still tirelessly campaign to have the government provided pension increase, government pensions are of course provided through taxation, which is of course paid largely by workers' taxation. And therefore, Australian workers felt that their employers had a responsibility to contribute after, as I said, they had reaped the benefit of these workers' lifetime of hard work. So superannuation in Australia doesn't replace, it supplements the government-provided age pension. The government-provided age pension remains a very vital component of Australian workers' retirement incomes. And rolling industrial action was taken in Australia to win our system of superannuation. Something that I don't think we give sufficient credit to is that many of the people and the workers who took this industrial action, who sacrificed their wages to win superannuation by going on strike, were never going to reap the full benefit of superannuation because they were well into their working lives. However, they made these sacrifices for the principle of dignity for working people. And I believe that we have a responsibility to honour and to uphold what these workers built for all workers through their own sacrifices. As Joe has said, we are very proud today that many regard Australia's superannuation system as world-class. Australian workers now have 3.5 trillion Australian dollars in superannuation savings for their retirement, and the majority of this is managed by what we call industry super funds. Funds run through an equal representation model where half of the board is made up of worker representatives through their unions, the other half by employer representatives, and where all of the profits that are generated are returned to workers, not to shareholders. As custodians of workers' money, Australian unions take very seriously our responsibility to preserve and grow workers' retirement savings and to invest workers' capital in ways that will improve workers' working and retirement lives. In Australia, as Joe has also alluded to, workers' capital owns key infrastructure all across our country. If you travel around Australia, many of our ports, both sea and air, many of the buildings that make up our skylines, and much of our key energy infrastructure is owned by working people through the workers' capital that they hold in their superannuation funds. This means that workers have a say over how these assets and projects are managed to ensure they are done so in workers' best interests, and the profits that these assets generate go back to workers to enrich their retirement lives. I think that this is a truly transformative thing. Our superannuation system also means that workers, through their capital, can influence the labour, environmental and governance practices at many large companies and in many key industries for the betterment of our society. Australian workers' capital, through their industry super funds, is invested responsibly to ensure good environmental governance and social outcomes. Workers' capital is not passively, but is actively invested to ensure that it drives improvement and best practice, and it's divested where those two things cannot be achieved. Workers' capital works to build the type of country and society that Australian workers want to live and retire in by providing the necessary capital to ensure that there is sufficient things like affordable housing for working people near their places of employment, and through working with government to fund our transition to a net zero economy to protect workers' working and retirement lives from climate disaster. These nation-building investments contribute to creating a country that workers want to live in and a long-term sustainable investments that deliver high returns that maximise workers' retirement incomes. The ACTU and Australian unions contribute to the responsible investment of workers' capital both in Australia and around the world through the practical realisation of international solidarity with working people around the globe. As Phil has recounted tonight, Mann was instrumental in facilitating international solidarity, where British unions contributed to Australian strike funds and Australian unions did the same, both supporting labour rights at opposite ends of the globe. The emergence of workers' capital through our superannuation and pension funds in our increasingly globalised world and economy means that workers' retirement savings are increasingly intertwined with one another. The ACTU and Australian unions are involved in the International Trade Union Confederation's Committee on Workers' Capital. This brings together union trustees from around the world to ensure that workers' capital from around the world encourages best practice labour rights, responsibly manages labour risks, and delivers high returns for working people everywhere. Union trustees engage collectively with companies like Amazon, Tesla, Starbucks, Microsoft, Walmart, and with asset managers like BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, and State Street to drive improvements in labour standards and to ensure that there is a reduction in labour risks. Improved labour standards and the management of labour risks mean, of course, improvements for workers in their working lives, but also improvements to the returns on their workers' capital and therefore improvements to their retirement lives. These initiatives, I think, are a fantastic demonstration of international solidarity, for which I like to think Tom Mann would be very proud. Thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you, Casey. And I might be slightly biased, but I could talk about superannuation for the rest of the evening. But I think looking at the chat, there is some appetite for continuing that discussion. So let's park that for now. But I do want to reiterate that I think one of the amazing things out of our system are the workers who took sustained industrial action knowing that they would never see the benefits of this system. And for that as the foundation of the system, I think is an incredible legacy for the labour movement for our country. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker. Yes, I can spot her. Dr. Emma Runswick is a junior doctor in psychiatry in Northwest England and is deputy chair of BMA Council, a union still engaged in multiple pay disputes in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Welcome, Emma.
Thanks so much, Jo, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to people around the world listening. As Jo's just said, I am a doctor working in psychiatry in England. And I am also an elected leader in our union of almost 200,000 doctors, the British Medical Association. And that is unusual in the UK for trade union leadership to be simultaneously in work. And I think that's pretty crucial to some of the ideas that Phil and Nigel were talking about before, about intelligence, about workers self-organising. I think it's a really key element of the way that our campaign has been run by workers themselves. And it's one reason that we remain in dispute. Though we were slightly late to the UK strike wave, starting our strike action in March 2023, we remain in a proactive dispute for pay restoration. Pay restoration is a demand now taken up across the UK labour movement for a reversal of the real terms pay cuts that we have faced since the crash in 2008, particularly in the public sector, but also more widely. It is a political demand in many ways. It is also a crucial demand for those of us who want to maintain our public healthcare system, the National Health Service, as unfortunately low wages and poor working conditions are driving doctors into the international market, particularly to yourselves in Australia, where I can see some of my former comrades are in the chat. So some of you, good to see you again, and I'm sorry you felt you had to move. That shift, that development into a proactive demand away from the more defensive campaigns that our union has run in the past, has led to us gaining 40,000 members, increasing our density amongst junior doctors or residents, as you might call them, around the world. Our density is now about 90%. And we have done that by organising ourselves within and beyond the trade union structures. You know, Nigel and Phil talked about, talked about without the internet. Tom Mann did all of this work, but we are able to learn the lessons of those past disputes and also use our modern tools. I have contact immediately through my phone with thousands of other members, and we do that by disseminated power. Reps take responsibility for large groups of members that they can contact immediately and feed in information and feed out information and mutually organise peer-to-peer. We've also made other very significant changes new to our union, though not to the wider labour movement. For example, for the first time ever, we have a strike fund, and we often receive donations in Australian dollars. from our colleagues who have moved out, and indeed others. We are lucky enough that our workforce is international. Over 25% of doctors in the UK have immigrated to the UK from somewhere else in the world, predominantly India, Pakistan, West Africa. And we learn a great deal from those individuals, from the movements and the labour traditions that they bring to us. And we have developed increasingly our international medical graduate system to learn from those who have come from India, who know about the general strike in India, from Kenya, from Nigeria. And those lessons both allow us to better represent those members who are in the UK now on the various issues that are crucial to them, particularly the racist Home Office system. But they also allow us to learn from the struggles elsewhere in the world. We take very, very seriously our international work in the BMA, and it would be remiss of me not to mention the doctors who are currently practicing in extreme conditions in Gaza and the difficulties that they are facing, but also the doctors on strike in South Korea, who, for a lack of workforce planning and the strike that has led from that, are now facing arrests, raids, and strikes to threats to strike them from the medical register so that they can never work again. And the responses of governments, both in South Korea but also around the world, to the shift back to organising, the shift to workers' power, particularly amongst medical workers, but by no means only amongst medical workers, is an indication of the struggle that we face when we are attempting to regain power, to shift that dial, to create that workers' control. People are talking about in the chat about superannuation and workers' control, but also in Tom Mann's ideas about workers' control. And the work that we still have to do to organise ourselves into a position where we can take far more of that. I know we're behind time, so I'll pause there. And I might put the Strike Fund link in the chat if you're keen to help us out. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emma, and solidarity for all that the BMA is doing and in your fight going forward. Really, really fantastic to have you on the panel today to talk about those experiences and that massive importance of those fights being genuinely worker-led and building up from the base. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our next panel speaker, Damien Carhill. Damien is General Secretary of the Australian National Tertiary Economy at the University of Sydney. Wage theft and a scourge of insecure work. So Damien, you're really, really welcome, and the floor
Great.
is yours.
Thanks for that. Let me know if the sound quality is a problem. Hey, comrades, I just want to acknowledge that I'm on stolen Aboriginal land and that sovereignty was never ceded. It's wonderful to be here. Nice to see some familiar faces and nice to see some comrades from the UK as well. I'm just going to talk very, very briefly about the campaign that we've been running in our union for job security for casual workers in universities in Australia. And just reflecting on the comments by other speakers, although we have faced the same level of ferocity of response by employers and the state as was encountered by Tom Mann and his comrades back in the early 20th century, I think there is nonetheless a resonance between our campaign in a fairly small section of the economy in Australia and the struggles of the early 20th century, because in fighting for the rights of casual workers and fighting for job security, the bosses in our sector have resisted strongly and they have used militant tactics to defend exploitative modes of employment that are central to their business model, and we've had to act commensurately, which I'll talk about very, very briefly. I know we're pressed for time. Just to give you some context, the National Tertiary Education Union that I'm the General Secretary of, we represent workers in higher education, and we work mainly in universities, and we represent both academic staff and professional staff. So we are an industry union. We're not just an academics union. And professional staff, non-academic staff, are actually the majority of university staff in Australia. To give you an idea of the workforce, unfortunately, universities in Australia are significantly based on insecure employment. So about 70% of all workers in universities in Australia are without a permanent job. They're either on in casual forms of work or on short-term contracts. About 40% are casual, 30% are short-term contracts. Only 30% of workers in Australian universities have a permanent job, which is a shocking indictment on the system. And then in terms of our own, my union, I think if we're honest with ourselves, historically, although we had campaigned on casual issues, I think we'd never fully prioritised the issues that were specific to casual workers, and particularly job security, and hence we've had low levels of casual membership historically. Even though about 40% of the sector were in casual employment, that wasn't replicated within our union. But that started to change during the pandemic, which really showed, if people needed a reminder, that we needed to prioritise casual issues, because when the pandemic hit within Australia, and I guess this gets to the international dimension of of the situation in Australia. Casual workers in Australia and in higher education were the first to lose their jobs. What the situation in higher education is, although universities are publicly funded, the only portion of their funding that's variable, and the only way they can increase their funding, is through the international student market. So they're significantly dependent on international student fee income, so those international flows of capital. When those dried up because the government closed the borders because of COVID, casual workers lost their jobs in their thousands. And at the same time, it became very clear the perverse social consequences of casuals having no access to paid leave, such as sick leave, not just in higher education, but in many sections of the labour market. And so as a result of that, our union, to simplify what is a much more complex story, we resolved to prioritise issues to do with casual employment. We began with a campaign against wage theft, so underpayments, which is rife in our sector because 40% of workers are casual, and it's just an easy way for employers to engage in the super exploitation of casuals, not paying them for work that's actually required for them to do their job. Things like turning up to lectures, things like putting comments on when marking essays, things that are absolutely central to doing their job. And so far, $150 million in stolen wages have been recovered, and there's much more out there. But of course, the best way to avoid wage theft and eliminate it is to convert casual work into permanent work and give those workers ongoing jobs. So in our latest round of collective bargaining across the sector, we've prioritised secure jobs for casuals. And again, to simplify what's a much more complex story, we've won significant reductions in casualisation. So over 2,500 new secure jobs created so far through our campaign. And what we've done is we've enforced through our new collective bargaining contracts a reduction in the casual proportion of work that's being performed, with a concurrent obligation for employers to convert that casual work into ongoing permanent work, and with preference being given to existing casuals in applying for that work. It's varied university by university, but that's the basic parameters of what we've been campaigning for. And importantly, as part of this campaign, we've also won in some universities, but we still need to universalise this, for the first time in our sector, paid sick leave for casuals. In Australia, in much of the labour market, casuals have no access to any paid leave entitlements. We've won that for casuals, and we've also won in some places, again, paid gender affirmation leave for casuals. And again, we need to universalise that now. How did we win this? Well, as I said before, the bosses resisted this pretty fiercely because it's central to their business model. Casuals are paid much less than ongoing workers. They don't have the same levels of liability, and they can get rid of casuals at a moment's notice. So the bosses resisted pretty strongly. They used fairly militant tactics. And so in response, we campaigned collectively and visibly. We used industrial action at least half of our sites around the country. And we used the wage theft campaign to shame bosses into admitting that there was a problem with casualisation, and that the inappropriate use of casual labour was having a negative effect on the quality of education, because workers were being forced to work for free, essentially. As a result of this, our membership has grown, and I'm pleased to say that 60% of all new members who have joined in the last couple of years have been casual. So I think it's started, the fact that we've been prioritised, I think this is due to the fact that we've prioritised job security for casuals, and we've had a credible strategy to win. Just in terms of lessons that we've learnt from this campaign, to campaign for marginalised groups, you need internal solidarity. It's not a given that this will exist within a union. You need to have the arguments, you need to have the discussions, but it's something that needs to happen. You know, new workers are coming into our sector and into many sectors, and they need to have their interests represented. And I think that's what we've started to do. Another lesson is it's difficult to change something that's central to the boss's business model. We've started down that path, but by no means have we eradicated insecure work. What we've shown, though, is that it is possible through active campaigns to start to wind back some of those strategies that are central to the boss's business model. And I think the final thing that we've learned is that the experience of COVID and employer responses to it has opened up, at least in our sector, and I think right across the economy, a new willingness among workers to take action and to take militant action, and a new awareness about precarious modes of employment and their negative social consequences. And I think this is true probably not just in Australia, but in terms of the international dimension in many countries around the world as well. Comrades, I'll leave it there. Happy to discuss any of these issues later, but it's great to be here, and thanks for the discussion.
Thank you, Damien. It's really great that I'm in the middle of these two speakers from education unions, as I spent just over 2 decades organising in education unions in Australia, including 17 years with Damien. And I just would really like to acknowledge, Damien's leadership, and with the rest of the leadership team, has really stepped up the NTU's work in this space. It has been a problem for a long time, and I think, you know, some of the wins and the organising outcomes have just been phenomenal. So congratulations from me in particular. And really warm welcome to Kate Taylor, who is a primary school teacher, workplace rep and national executive member of the National Education Union, the sister union, the largest education union in Europe. Welcome, Kate.
Hi, thank you so much, Anna. It's just been such a fantastic event so far. It's brilliant to hear all the different speakers in the chat as well, just for inspiring me and, you know, keeping me going and for us to all keep fighting. I just wanted to start, for those of you that haven't heard of it, to talk a little bit about Strike Map, which is one of the sponsors of today's event. They've been building and supporting industrial action over the last few years in the UK, set up in 2020, and it's a digital map of industrial action that's taking place. I believe part of its success is that it's powered and grown directly by the workers. And as we've heard frequently already in this meeting, the change must begin with the workers. It's united reps across different sectors, enabling them to build networks and create strike clubs. It's mapped 230,000 strikes so far and signed up over 4,000 people to visit their nearest picket lines. I've used it a number of times to get to RMT and BMA picket lines. With over 100 affiliates, it's raised thousands for strike funds, which are so necessary for those of us taking industrial action. It enables others to see different actions taking place and to pass on messages of solidarity. And this in turn encourages other workers in their struggles. They see that they're not alone in their unrest. And as we know, building and networking is essential, and Strike Map brings those leading struggles together through the network. So why is it that organisations like Strike Map are so needed at the moment in the UK? We've been suffering under the failed austerity project of the Conservative government for 14 years now. The country is completely decimated. Public services are a shadow of their former selves. 1 in 5 people in the UK live in poverty. 4.3 million children are living in poverty, and those numbers are just rising. But we know that the money is there. It simply rests in the wrong place. It is in the bank accounts of the super rich who gatekeep more money than they will ever need or be able to spend, while the poor get steadily poorer. Since 2010, the combined wealth of the 10 richest people in the UK has increased from 70 billion to 210 billion pounds. They could pay their taxes, reduce their profits, and it would go a long way to solving many problems in this country. And I'd argue that they wouldn't even miss it. There was a time not so long ago when we had some hope. We had an opposition leader who had a vision of a different future through an elected government. But I don't think we have that hope anymore. Some people are still under the illusion that an incoming Labour government will save us, but I don't believe that they will. So our campaigning moving forward has to be aimed at Labour as much as it has to be aimed at the Conservatives. So on to my union, the NEU. We are the largest education union in Europe, and we have nearly 446,000 members. That rose by 50,000 after our strike action last year. Just to briefly paint a picture of education in Britain at the minute, funding in real terms is below the level that it was in 2010. We have a massive recruitment and retention crisis amongst class teachers. The government has missed their teacher training targets for years. A third of teachers leave within 5 years of training. Class sizes are the highest in Europe, with fewer support staff in classes than ever before, meaning teachers are overstretched and children are not receiving the support that they need. We have a crisis in SEND education, with a desperate lack of provision for children with additional needs, a lack of support from external agencies, and specialist interventions from services such as mental health teams taking up to 2 years to be allocated. Schools are poorly resourced, with educators themselves and parents funding essential supplies for schools. Our buildings are crumbling and have been for years. And with a new crisis in the discovery of RAC, hundreds of schools now are not safe for children or staff. We're slowly being taken over by an academy system which sees schools run by trusts as businesses. And these academy trusts do not improve standards for children and certainly do not improve terms and conditions for staff. In fact, many do not recognise unions at all. So as you can see, it is a little bleak in education right now. But in the NEU, we organise, we build, and in the last year, we've taken significant national action. In 2022, we held a ballot on pay and funding, and we beat the incredibly restrictive targets set by the government. We held meetings in branches and schools to ensure that members understood the importance of the vote and why we were balloting. We engaged reps and we asked them to have conversations with all their members, encouraging them to vote. We held phone banking sessions, which were really effective in engaging those members who hadn't voted yet. We were asking for a fully funded, above inflation pay rise after 14 years of real terms pay cuts that leave us with a wage 25% lower in real terms than it was in 2010. Our action began in February last year. And in March, after 2 days of action, the Welsh Government offered 3% to teachers, which was rejected by members. And quickly there came an offer of 5% with a 1.5% non-consolidated lump sum. This was put to Welsh teachers and they settled. But in England, the strike continued and we took 6 more days of action. We had more pickets in more schools than ever before. We We had rallies and strike breakfasts and huge national demo in London with 50,000 turning out to demand that teachers got the pay rise that they need. It was a creative, vibrant campaign, and we retained the moral high ground throughout. In England, we eventually won a 6.5% pay increase for teacher members. And I say increase as inflation was around 10%. So in reality, it was just another pay cut. Some of us would have liked to continue the fight, but we banked the increase and committed to beginning the battle again this year. Teachers in England still earn significantly less than their colleagues in Scotland, so we're not finished. The funding issue has not been resolved, pay has not been restored, and educators are still leaving the profession in droves, so we fight on. We're in the middle of 2 indicative ballots, one for teachers and one for support staff. For support staff, we're asking them if they would strike alongside the other support unions should they vote for strike action this year. And for teachers, we're asking for a fully funded pay rise. This time, we're asking that that wage begins to restore some of the pay that we've had taken away from us over the years. The government thinks that they're doing a good job with education, and we disagree. We're hopeful that our members are going to tell them this by beating the thresholds again. This ballot takes place under the threat of the introduction of minimum service levels. For education, it would mean around 70% of children would be in school on a strike day. All primary children would be in school. All children with special educational needs would be in school. All children in care or considered vulnerable would be in school. So this means that any strike action would be pointless. Schools would basically still be open. If we put the national disputes to one side and imagine that you have a head teacher who's a bully, who's making staff's lives a misery, policies not being followed and excessive workload is the norm, what will staff be able to do to change that? The introduction of minimum service levels would be a disaster for workers. And for me, our current ballot is about protecting the right to strike for all of us. Strikes to maintain the right to strike is what we all need. So what do we do? Sometimes it's tempting to give up, but we should look to people to inspire us, learn about them, and take motivation from people who've had the battle before. How did they do it? How did they make it work? How did they win for workers? And we can look to people like Tom Mann to be that person. He was an English trade unionist fighting this fight in the late 1800s, beginning near my hometown of Birmingham. He was a lifelong advocate of socialism and a successful organiser, active in England and Australia. He was a member of many different political parties and organisations throughout his lifetime, but what ran through those different roles was a fundamental belief that socialism could only be achieved through trade unionism and cooperation, a belief that parliamentary democracy was inherently corrupt. And I think that we can all get on board with that in the UK right now. His outlook on life gave him a firm conviction that the social problem could and would be solved. The more that we build, agitate, and galvanise our efforts, the more we demand and organise, the closer we will get to solving those problems that impact so many of us so deeply. So keep working, keep fighting, and keep uniting the struggle in solidarity with all workers of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that fantastic contribution. Solidarity with the NEU in its current struggles, those massively important struggles, not just to defend your members' terms and conditions, but also to defend the education system that our children and the future of our society relies on. Thanks also for your comments about Strike Map and telling us a little bit more about the work of Strike Map. At the General Federation of Trade Unions, we are really proud to work in partnership with Strike Map, a very close working relationship. The GFTU, with 28 affiliates and around 600,000 affiliated members, provides a wide range of trade union education, looking at political education, political economy, education around organising, and labour history. And to be able to link that with a grassroots project like Strike Map, which reaches out to so many new potential workers, activists, organisers in the movement, is hugely important. So really pleased as well to have Strike Map on board with today's meeting. Before I introduce our final panel speaker, I just want to remind again, if you've got any questions you would like to put to our panelists, we will have a little bit of time for questions after our final speaker, please do put them in the Q&A box at the bottom, not in the chat, but look down at the bottom, you'll see Q&A there. Pop your questions in there so they can be put to our panel of speakers, as many of them as we can manage before the end of today. But finally, it is my great pleasure to welcome our final speaker for today, Luke Whittington. Luke is the Executive Officer of Search Foundation, a member-run organisation that draws together activists from different political parties, movements, and generations that support the values of democratic ecological socialism. He's worked advising state and national MPs on international campaigns, organising contract cleaners for the LHMU, now UWU. So Luke, you are very, very welcome here, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gawain. Thanks, everybody. I'm Luke Whitington. As Gawain has said, I'm on Gundungurra and Darug land, where we say Warami Gamarada, welcome comrades. This land was taken without consent, without treaty, and without compensation, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thanks to the organisers of this meeting tonight. I'm a bit of a late inclusion on the team list, but I'm delighted to be getting a run. I think I was included because I emceed Phil's event a couple of weeks ago. I'm usually the MC in the MC's chair for events for the Search Foundation, so it's an honour to be given a chance to say a few words myself and do things a bit differently tonight. I've got three main points I wanted to make in relation to Tom Mann's legacy and its relevance to the struggle today. Firstly, that we need more leaders like Tom Mann, someone that was both genuinely representative of the working class, but also committed to the use of reasoned argument, rational, critical thinking, and seeking the truth even when it's hard to face. Because reason itself, truth and critical thinking, is under assault from the authoritarian right. And we cannot let that stand if we are to have a democratic political system and, as I think all of us agree here, a democratically controlled economy. Secondly, I'll note Mann's internationalism and talk about some of my experience in international or transnational union action and its evergreen importance to working class people. And then I'll finish on the importance of building capability through education, networks and connections, something that Mann obviously never tired of. Tom Mann was clearly of and for the working class. To quote AMWU leader Laurie Carmichael's article on Tom Mann, at the age of 9, he started working, dragging mulk overburden from coal mine ventilation shafts in steel boxes made like sledges without wheels, 30 inches long, 18 inches wide, and 18 inches deep. For 4 years, these were pulled on all fours with a chain attached to a belt around his waist and thighs. A candle on the box lit his way. It's a complaint as old as the movement to bemoan that we have too many people in the labour movement from middle-class origins, and to say we need more leaders and representatives that are truly from the shop floor. But it's worth reiterating the importance of finding, organising and training people in our current workplaces, especially among the most exploited, alienated and marginalised, that can take on those leadership roles. I've been lucky enough to work with workers that are often invisible and forgotten, like cleaners and hotel workers, and see them develop into advocates and leaders as Tom Mann did. But we need more of it, especially as our right-wing opponents give people with similar backgrounds, but views that serve the interests of the wealthy minority, a platform and broadcast them on the many platforms that they own. So leaders and representatives from working class communities need to be encouraged and supported, but at the same time, it's not the left's role to promote anti-intellectualism or anti-rationality. Indeed, it's urgent that anti-reason is called out and opposed. At the same time as being a true working class hero, Tom Mann was also highly educated, speaking several languages, playing the violin and studying astronomy, and being extremely well read, not to mention being well read, as the Seinfeld joke goes. Above all, he was rational, reasoned, and spoke to an audience in person and via media in a way which respected their ability for reason. He was capable of firing up a crowd, of course, but he was not an unethical rabble-rouser or demagogue, although, like all effective union leaders, he was called those things by conservative opponents. To quote the 8th commandment of Tom Mann's Socialist Sunday School, held in Melbourne and Sydney in 1908, observe and think in order to discover the truth. Do not believe what is contrary to reason. Never deceive yourself or others. That commandment is something I think we need to preserve from our glorious reason, critical and ethical thinking itself is under threat. We can't give up on it. Trump and Boris Johnson be post-truth, ultra-relativist, ultra-liberal, if you like, where all opinions or truths are valid, no matter what arguments are used to support them. We need to stand up for reason, critical thinking, objective truth, even and especially when the development of communications technology, the internet, has made it harder for reasoned positions to prevail and far easier for lies and simplistic solutions to spread. Never deceive yourself or others. The story of Tom Mann's life also reminds us that international campaigns can be highly effective in getting international capital to the negotiating table and winning for working class people. His work in regional WA, Victoria, and in the Broken Hill lockout is long remembered in Australia, not least by an article by Don Sutherland, who's already commented a couple of times in the chat. Thanks for coming, Don. Now, international coordination is often easier said than done. I think there was something to be noted and recognised about Tom Mann, something I picked up from Phil's book, his willingness to be extremely broad in building solidarity and seeking allies that would support whatever cause he was fighting for at a given time. For example, he worked to bring over the strikebreakers union in the Broken Hill lockout, and after initial resistance succeeded. He sought support and often won it from allies in the UK from across different industries and parties and so on. And of course, once you leave your own shores, as Tom often did, even among friends and comrades in the union movement, there are always local conditions that you as an outsider would take a different approach to, but which due to history or local conditions, the great mass of people there will not easily be dissuaded from. This is not to excuse genuine red lines that cannot be crossed, but simply to say that wherever possible, we should and must work across boundaries for the benefit of all working people. I have some experience of this, and I'd like to see more of it. As an organiser and lead organiser at the Liquor, Hospitality and Miscellaneous Workers Union, now the United Workers Union, I took part in, and some people claim I came up with the name for, the Clean Start Fair Deal for Cleaners campaign. This campaign involved a $1 million investment from the USA's SEIU, working with New Zealand and Australian unions to pressure building owners, as opposed to cleaning contractors, to guarantee a suite of working conditions and, importantly, organising rights for cleaning workers in major commercial buildings across Australasia. It was a long and difficult struggle, but ultimately led to big wins for the cleaning workers. Now, our US comrades and their union leadership would often hold very divergent political, geopolitical, and social views to many of us involved in the movement in Australia. One of the leaders of the SEIU at the time was Andy Stern. Many people would disagree with Stern's politics and methods, but I think it was worth working with Stern and the SEIU regardless of that because of the success of the campaign and the results that it achieved. Tom Mann worked with all kinds of people across many nations in pursuit of working class power. That's worth remembering in a world where international capital is even more mobile and powerful than in his day. Finally, that ecumenical attitude informs much of what I do for the Search Foundation. Search is primarily involved in connecting socialists from different unions, different parties, geographies, and generations, and then building their capabilities, knowledge, and networks. We do this by running events where people meet, learn, and express their views, such as online and in-person presentations, forums, conferences, and dedicated education sessions. Recently, we've been working with the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, delivering education sessions on workers' politics, political economy, the politics of distribution and production. The AMWU is the successor union to the Amalgamated Engineers, which up until the 1960s was actually a section of the UK union, and Tom Mann was its general secretary at one point. As AMW National Official Dave Henry explained at the Sydney launch of Phil Katz's book, Tom Mann's legacy in that union is immense. Tom Mann Theatre is its central Sydney meeting place, and actually where our office used to be. We're now with the Unionated Broad at the Maritime Union building in Sydney, but I digress. The AMWU has long been known for its commitment to mindful militancy, analysing and acting in a strategic and conscious way in the interests of the entire working class, sometimes at the expense of members' pay packets. One such difficult choice led to the creation of key planks in the foundation of the Australian welfare state in relation to health, Medicare, and to retirement incomes, the super system, which also led to major structural changes to the Australian economy that have changed the nature of ownership of large swathes of the economy's productive and financial assets. That's the super system that Casey Thompson and Dr. Joe Kowalczyk spoke to us about earlier. I didn't know they were going to speak exactly on those things, but I had that already in my talk for you. We're working with AMW and interested in working with others to continue to develop the class consciousness and critical thinking skills that define so much of what Tom Mann stood for. As I said, we'd like to work more broadly around Australia and internationally in similar partnerships. And we're always up for organising events like this one and the ones you'll find on our YouTube channel with international guests and audiences. There's probably a lot more I could say, such as about how Tom Mann's socialism sustained and energised him, but I'll leave it there and thank you for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you.
Thank you, Luke. That was fantastic. And thank you to all of our panelists. We are hard up against it in time. So what we're proposing to do is I'm just going to read out 3 questions that I'll get each of the panelists to maybe give a very short 1-minute response to one or more of those, and then a final question to Phil. So the questions are really around, with the growth in short-term and precarious work and contracts, basically more insecure employment, how do we respond to the challenge of pensions and superannuation supporting working people in their older age? So the job insecurity, retirement. The second question is, how do we ensure that the UK Minimum Services Level Act is binned? And if someone can explain that to me in less than 10 seconds, that would be excellent. And finally, it was a question for Katie, but relevant to everyone. How do we keep momentum going in our campaigns? And the question was specifically about your current campaign, Katie. And the assumption there that a lot of teachers are under the impression that Labor will come to the rescue. And so we'll get some feedback. We might just go in the order in which people spoke. And then a couple of final words from Phil. Luke just talked about the Laurie Carmichael, and Tom Mann had a great impact on his kind of experience and others within the leadership of that union. Can you just sum up some of those comments about what Mann said and their contemporary relevance for the AMWU and the movement more generally? So if that made sense, I'm going to throw to Nigel first.
Oh, thanks, Joe. And wow, I've been writing a lot while you've all been speaking, so that has been really, really incredibly useful for me. But I'm just going to hit 2 questions really quickly. In terms of organising workers who are in precarious contracts, who are in precarious work, I mean, this is the growth industry in economies now. Yeah, everybody is heading towards precarious and 0-hour contracts. So it's a question that's of huge significance. One of the things that we can say is that we've faced this before. Tom Mann himself was very much at the forefront of battling against the casualised workforces on docks, for example, at the end of the 20th century, sorry, the end of the 19th century. A lot of dock workers were casually employed. They would turn up every day for whatever, half a day or a day's work. In the UK, organising these workers was seen as an almost impossible task. But Tom Mann and others led the way in terms of saying we can do it because we've got demands that unite everybody. It's in nobody's interest to continue to have a situation where you turn up cap in hand looking for a job every morning. And it was termed new unionism, and Tom was very, very much part of that whole drive to move unions away from simply being craft trade unions organising skilled workers into organising workers with no rights, with no security, no contracts. And that is exactly the same challenge we're facing now. And very recently in London, in the UK, Deliveroo drivers, casually employed massively, organised their own strike action without any reference to the anti-trade union laws in the UK and did it successfully. So the answers are out there, and I think we have to look to see where these workers are and talk to them and ask them how are we going to get organised, rather than thinking that we as institutions have got something already on paper that we can just hand over to them. So that'd be the first thing. The second thing, minimum strike levels in the UK is the latest anti-trade union proposal, whereby the government would like a situation where employers are able to instruct certain workers to attend work, even though they're members of the union, even though they've been part of an official ballot, to instruct them to attend work in order to provide minimum levels of service in schools, on the railways, in the hospitals, etc. And the best way to break those is just to defy that law. And actually, StrikeMap and TUC and many others are already doing that. The NEU are very, very much in the National Education Union UK, very much at the front of that. That essentially, we'll say to our employers before we strike, don't even try that. And as one General Secretary said, I know if it was me and I was instructed to come to work that day, well, I've always got the option of ringing in sick. But we can make it unworkable. And that is the way forward in terms of making sure that law never lives to see the light of day. We can't rely on Labour to repeal laws like that. So it is in our own hands. Thanks very much, Joe. I hope that rapid response gave everybody else time to think of something sensible to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Nigel. Casey.
Thanks, Joe. I'll just quickly comment on the insecure work question and its relationship to pensions or superannuation. Of course, as we've discussed today, those that are employed insecurely or in precarious employment will always suffer because of that insecure and precarious employment. So, of course, naturally, one of the ways that they will suffer will be through superannuation or their employer contributed pension. And as we've also discussed today, women often bear the brunt of that, particularly when they have to take flexible working arrangements for caring responsibilities and take time out of the workforce to raise children. As you said, Joe, of course, in Australia, we recently got superannuation paid on Commonwealth paid parental leave. So I think, you know, there's important mechanisms there to ensure that what we like to say, super should be paid to every worker on every dollar earned. So if there are wages above your base wage, like paid parental leave or overtime or allowances, you should be receiving superannuation or pension payments for that work. So we've got a lot of work to do in Australia on that front. But I do think it's also important when we talk about precarious employment and underemployment in terms of superannuation to remember that superannuation isn't a magic bullet that can solve all of our problems. And, you know, I think that means that there's two other, in particular, key things that we need to do. So, of course, as Damien said, we need to tackle the root of the problem, which is underemployment, precarious, insecure employment, you know, an over-reliance of casual employees to ensure that people have permanent, ongoing, secure employment. I think we need to tackle that fundamental issue. And then, as I also said in my remarks, we also need to ensure that there are other safety nets in addition to superannuation or pensions, like a government-provided pension. And as I said, Australian unions are very mindful of ensuring that that maintains strong and that that always is being raised to align with, you know, increasing cost of living, because superannuation is never going to be something that workers can rely entirely on. We're going to need to simultaneously ensure that there is good, strong welfare payments that people can receive if they need to, and that, of course, you know, the great work, like Damien alluded to, is being done through workers' unions to fundamentally secure their employment.
Thanks, Casey. Emma.
Yeah, much like Nigel said, casualised labour is nothing new. In the UK, we used to have people sign on the lump or being picked out of the pen. In UK medicine, the reliance on casualised labour or locum doctors has made action actually incredibly easy to take. You know, there are downsides to casualised labour, but there are also upsides when we're thinking about organising. We have a massive burden of anti-trade union legislation in the UK, which really tightens the screw on unions specifically, but also workers. But it's mostly aimed at unions, trying to get unions to police their own members. When you have casualised workforces, they can take action often in a much more easy way. in a way that can be tomorrow, next week, yesterday, and not just after 6 or 8 weeks of a postal ballot that is run officially and requires you to have more than 50% vote yes. More than 50% of your entire workforce vote yes, which is a requirement that we have for most strike action. And that has meant that in UK medicine, we have had large-scale rate strikes, which have increased pay for casualised workers, but also improved conditions. So, there are positives and negatives to this. Obviously, they are mostly negative, but we can find routes through to organising here by learning from our past. Minimum service level is just another anti-union law in the UK. And the crucial thing is not really about its impacts on workers. We've never had a right to strike in the UK, and the qualified immunity from dismissal for strike action only arrived under the new Labour government in 2000. So previous to that, there were strikes. There were strikes previous to 2000, and people relied on their ability, their solidarity with each other to avoid dismissal. The real threat for MSL is to unions, that unions will attempt to police their own members, because the threat of not doing so is injunction, for which the requirements are trivial. Is there a reasonable question to be tried? And then the threat of contempt of court, which has unlimited fines, sequestration, and so on. So we should expect that most unions, despite all of the talk from the TUC and Strike Map and so on, will police their members or will attempt to. The question for workers of all kinds is, are you going to listen to your unions, or are you going to organise with each other to overcome that? There are some working strategies. So ASLEF, the train drivers union in the UK, has responded to MSL consultation, minimum service levels consultation, by calling more strike action and more action short of strike, which has prevented any employer so far using minimum service levels. However, in the government-run industries like health, we can expect them to be used. We would be naive to not expect them to be used. We expect those, certainly in medicine, to be directly unsafe. We already organise our own cover as doctors for urgent, emergency and critical work. We do not think that management and admin have the capability of doing so. So we will be asking our members to continue to organise their own safe cover. What are the strike? Okay, their own safe cover, and encouraging people to take additional action where we have minimum service levels or attempted to impose. Thanks.
Thanks, Emma. As Gawain's noticed, we're now officially running over time. So Damien, Kate, Luke, hit it briefly.
All right, very, very quickly, just on the issue of insecure work and pensions, as Joe and Casey said, the superannuation funds that are run to profit members in Australia and 50% run by trade unions are a remarkable achievement. At the same time, superannuation funds and pension funds tend to reflect the inequalities within the labour market and replicate inequalities within the labour market. So if you're an insecurely employed worker, you will end your life with a small superannuation fund. So the answer to me is there's a role for the state in providing a guaranteed living income for all retired workers to supplement and work in conjunction with the superannuation system. That's not going to happen by itself. We need to campaign for that, institutionalise that solidarity within the apparatuses of the state. It's a much bigger issue, but I'll leave it there.
Okay, Kate.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I'll just talk about the question about education. So I think in relation to the Labour government, it's quite simple, really. The Labour government have offered nothing for education. They haven't offered more funding. They appear to have no policy whatsoever, to be honest. But keys around Ofsted, they haven't gone with the NEU call to scrap Ofsted. They're just going to reform it, which we don't believe is good enough. So I think we just have to keep highlighting their utter lack of any promise to education. In terms of keeping it going, I think that it's really, really important to keep having those conversations with people, keep talking to members, keep talking to other staff in the staff room, if you've got one, keep building, and then just to keep fighting and lighting those little fires in schools. And if we have a school where they've taken action on something that is individual to that school, they can see the power of what we can do when we pull together. So I really think it's not about the leaders. I think, although the leaders are important, it is about us, it's about members, and it's about, you know, just keeping those conversations and keeping that build going. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate. Luke has graciously reserved his right to speak, and we're going to hand over to Phil for some final comments and then back to Gawain. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I think that in a lot of the internationals that exist, they do really important work, but the voice of the person at work doesn't have sufficient space in the dialogue. And I think that I'm not proposing anything, but I think Strike Map, as outlined by Kate, is a very good vehicle for generating discussion across countries and across continents. And I wonder if we couldn't do something like this on other occasions. There was a question directly to me. I just want to say that I did use Laurie Carmichael's article in the book. It's an excellent article. People might not know that Tom meticulously drew up plans for evading the police during the Great Lockout. There was dynamite going off all over the place. It was a typical low-level Australian strike. But they've just found those plans again, and they are at the Broken Hill Trades Hall. So we're going to see them next week. And it was Laurie Carmichael that first had access to those. I think he had them on his wall. I've been discussing the book, the ideas of the book, making presentations, but also with the leadership of the AMWU and the MEU. And I can tell you there's great interest in the Mann ideas. The AMWU is buying a copy for every delegate at its annual conference later in the year. That's 500 delegates. So they'll all be able to read it as well. Mann said that you only speak to employers with one voice, and that the aim was to have one union for all industries, and that you have to raise your sights. And I think that's the message that has come from this tour. If you aim low, you only miss. And he used to ride into rural towns on horseback and ring a bell to tell people that there was going to be a political meeting on. They didn't even know about the Labour Party. They didn't even know about unions. So he said, I just spoke to them about socialism anyway, because people naturally understand that that is a solution to their problems. And I don't think we raise our vision enough. And I don't think we talk about socialism as an alternative enough. I think this meeting's been fantastic. Thanks to you, Joe, and to Gawain. I know you're going over time. Of course, I'd say read the book, but you don't have to, because you can now listen to it. It's an audio book. And better still, I'm not reading it out before Nigel says anything. It's got somebody that's got a nicer voice than me, but not a better accent.
Thanks so much, Phil, for your closing comments there. All that remains for me to do is to thank all of our panelists for today, to thank all of the attendees for playing a part in this really important sharing of knowledge and understanding from the trade union movement in the UK and in Australia. Particular thanks go to those who helped organise this meeting: Ram Kretzdite, Chloe Mansola, Paul McGee, Henry Fowler, John Dixon, and of course to Phil Katz himself for the book, for the tour. I do hope that you all get a copy of the book, whether that's in audio format or whether that's in written format. But thank you to everyone who played a role in bringing today's meeting together. Tom Mann's life story is an essay in, an education in worker organisation and internationalism. I know that we, all of us in this call today, are committed to worker organisation and to internationalism. And we, in the spirit of Tom Mann, will continue our solidarity and our close working together into the future to build something he would truly be proud of. Thank you.